For 7 weeks, the village lost one child every Thursday night. Not 2, not 3. Always 1. No doors were forced open, no windows were broken, no footprints were ever found leaving the houses. And yet, by Friday morning, one family in the village would always wake to the same impossible truth. A bed half empty, a room still cold, and a child who was simply gone. At first, they called it coincidence. By the 3rd Thursday, they stopped saying that word out loud. By the 5th, no parent in the village slept through the night. And by the 7th, they understood the worst part was not that a child kept disappearing. It was that Thursday kept coming. The winter of 1891 came early to Briar Hollow. By the first week of November, the road to the south was already half frozen over. The river crossing had become unreliable, and the forest beyond the fields was carrying sound strangely at night. Briar Hollow was not a large village, and that made patterns harder to hide. Everyone knew who was sick, who owed money, who had lost livestock, who had buried a parent, whose chimney smoked too little, whose lantern stayed lit too late. So when the first child disappeared, the shock spread quickly, but not quickly enough. Her name was Eliza Vane. She was 8 years old, the youngest of 4, and she vanished from the room she shared with her sisters on a Thursday night just after the first hard frost. Her mother swore the door had been bolted from inside. Her father said the windows had not been touched. By morning, the girl's blanket was on the floor, the room was freezing, and Eliza was gone. At first, the village explained it the way villages always do: sleepwalking, kidnapping, a family lie, a passing drifter, a wolf at the window. Anything that sounded ordinary enough to stop the mind from moving somewhere worse. Search parties went out before sunrise. Men crossed the fields with rifles and dogs. Others checked the wells, the riverbank, the old tannery road, and the tree line at the edge of the pines. Nothing. Not a scrap of cloth. Not a blood trail. Not a single print in the frost that made sense. By Sunday, Briar Hollow had folded the terror down into grief. It was still horrible, but it was survivable. One child taken by something no one understood was a tragedy. Tragedy, at least, is a shape people know how to carry. Then the second Thursday came. This time, it was a boy named Owen Pike, just 9 years old, gone from the loft above his parents' kitchen. Again, the family swore the door had been locked. Again, the shutters were still fastened. Again, there was no sign that anyone had entered or left. The only detail that seemed strange, and at first too small to matter, was that Owen's older sister had woken sometime after midnight because she thought she heard whistling outside. Not loud, not near the window, just somewhere in the lane between the houses. A few thin notes, then silence. That detail would have been forgotten if it had not happened again. By the 3rd Thursday, when Ruth Mercer disappeared from a narrow cottage near the chapel path, there were already people in Briar Hollow who had stopped undressing for bed on Wednesday nights. Fathers sat with rifles across their knees. Mothers slept in chairs in front of nursery doors. Lamps were kept burning until dawn, even in homes that could barely afford the oil. It changed nothing. Ruth vanished before sunrise. The door was still barred. Her small shoes were still beneath the bed. And this time, 3 people in 3 different houses reported hearing the same thing before midnight, whistling in the street. Not a tune anyone recognized, just enough melody to feel intentional. That was the week coincidence died. Once fear acquires a pattern, it becomes much harder to live with. Random loss terrifies people, but scheduled loss reorganizes them. It makes every hour before the event feel contaminated. By the 4th Thursday, Briar Hollow was no longer just afraid. It was waiting. That is what made it unbearable. The village began changing its habits to survive the week. Children were kept indoors from dusk onward. No one allowed them to sleep alone. Some families moved mattresses into kitchens so everyone could stay in the same room. Others nailed windows shut, pushed furniture against doors, or stayed awake until dawn on Thursday nights, convinced vigilance would be enough if they simply refused to relax. The fourth child vanished anyway. His name was Daniel Wren. He disappeared from between his two brothers. That detail broke something in the village, because up to that point, people could still pretend there was a gap they had missed. A door not properly bolted, a latch not checked, a noise ignored. But Daniel had gone from the center of a room full of sleeping bodies without waking any of them. His youngest brother insisted that when he stirred in the night, Daniel was still there. By morning, there was only the impression of a body in the blanket and a cold space where warmth should have been. After that, the village stopped asking how someone was getting in. They started asking something worse. What if nothing was entering at all? That question came first from Father Caldas, the priest, though he did not speak it publicly. He wrote it in his notes before he ever dared say it aloud. Most of what survives from the winter of 1891 comes from fragments attributed to him. Parish pages, burial records, household visits, and a stack of personal notes never meant for church review. He was not a dramatic man. That is partly why the pages matter. They do not read like folklore. They read like a man trying to keep his thoughts ordered while order itself is failing. After the fourth disappearance, he began listing similarities. Always Thursday, always one child, always taken from inside the house, always no sign of forced entry, always whistling somewhere in the village beforehand. And then, beneath those, one final line added in darker ink. No child was taken from a house where the mother remained awake. That line changed everything. Until then, the village had believed vigilance meant keeping watch at the door, the window, the street. But Father Caldas had noticed something subtler. In each home where a child vanished, the mother had at some point fallen asleep. Not necessarily for hours, sometimes only briefly, sometimes in a chair, sometimes with a lamp still burning beside her. In the homes where the whistling was heard but no child disappeared, the mothers had stayed awake until dawn. At first, no one wanted to believe him, because if he was right, then the village had not failed to stop an intruder. It had failed at something far more intimate. Staying conscious. By the fifth Thursday, Briar Hollow was no longer trying to solve a mystery. It was trying to survive a test. Mothers began preparing for Thursday like soldiers preparing for siege. Bitter tea, cold water basins, pins pressed into palms. One woman tied a length of cord from her wrist to the bedpost so she would jerk awake if her body slumped. Another recited scripture aloud all night to keep her mind from slipping. Several fathers begged to take the watch instead, but by then the pattern felt too specific to ignore. The village had begun to believe that whatever was moving through Briar Hollow did not come for children at random. It came for children through their mothers. The fifth child was not taken. That should have felt like victory. It didn't. Because the whistling came anyway. Longer this time, closer, passing beneath windows, sliding between houses, lingering outside homes where families sat fully dressed around cold hearths, refusing to blink too long, refusing to drift, refusing to surrender that one invisible threshold between wakefulness and sleep. By dawn, every child was still there, and the village understood that the pattern had not been broken. It had only been delayed. The sixth Thursday was worse, not because a child vanished, because the village began hearing things in addition to the whistling. A tap at the shutters, soft footsteps in the lane, a woman's voice, once very low, singing from beyond the Pike house just before midnight. No one opened a door. No one looked outside. The rule had become absolute by then. Once darkness fell on Thursday, no one responded to anything from beyond the walls. Still, before dawn, another child was gone. Martha Bell, age 7. Her mother had sworn she remained awake the entire night. When Father Caldas visited the house the next morning, he did not accuse her of lying. He asked instead whether she had dreamed. The woman burst into tears before answering. She said that sometime near dawn she had still been in the chair by the bed, still upright, still watching. Then she remembered hearing her own mother's voice behind her, not outside the house, but in the room itself, telling her just for a moment to close her eyes. Only for a moment, only to rest them. She did not remember sleeping, only opening them again to screams. That was when Father Caldus crossed something out in his earlier notes. The thing in Briar Hollow did not need sleep. It needed surrender. Any break in the mother's watch, whether sleep, trance, dream, or momentary absence, seemed to open the same door. By the seventh Thursday, the village looked less like a community and more like a place under ritual quarantine. No one worked after noon. No children were allowed out of arm's reach. Lamps were prepared before sunset. Doors were reinforced. Families gathered into houses with the strongest walls. And Father Caldus proposed the one measure no one wanted to hear. All mothers and children would remain together in the chapel until dawn. The men would stay outside. At first, the village resisted. The chapel was drafty, old, and small. But it was the only place in Briar Hollow where every child could be watched together, where every mother could watch every other mother, and where no one would be alone with fatigue. So by dusk that Thursday, the pews had been pushed back, blankets laid on the stone floor, and nearly every mother and child in the village was gathered beneath one roof. Outside, the men waited with lanterns and rifles. Inside, the women fought sleep. And then the whistling began. Not in the lane, not at the windows, above them, somewhere in the chapel rafters. It was faint at first, almost playful, drifting from one side of the roof to the other, as if something weightless were moving along the beams. Then it stopped directly above the center aisle and remained there, not sounding louder, but somehow sounding nearer. One of the younger children started crying. Another covered his ears. No one moved toward the doors. Father Caldus stood at the altar and began reading aloud, not from scripture this time, but from his own notes. Dates, names, houses, the pattern, the watch, the failures, the corrections. As if saying the thing plainly, naming its habits without fear, might weaken it. The whistling stopped. For one long minute, no one heard anything. Then every lamp in the chapel went out, not one after another, all at once. Panic broke immediately. Children screamed. A woman collapsed against a pew. Someone near the entrance shouted for the men outside, but the heavy winter wind swallowed the sound. In the blackness, Father Caldus kept speaking, his voice louder now, trying to force shape onto the dark. No mother let go of her child. No one slept. No one surrendered the watch. When the lamps were finally relit, everyone was still there. Almost. One pew near the back of the chapel was empty. Not of a child, of a mother. Anna Mercer, who had lost her daughter Ruth on the third Thursday, was gone. No one saw her leave. No door had opened. There were no footprints outside in the snow. That was the moment Briar Hollow finally understood the pattern they had been reading too narrowly. It had never been taking one child every Thursday because it wanted children. It had been taking one child every Thursday because children were the easiest way to train the village into obedience, into fear, into exhaustion, into building their entire lives around a single night. And once the pattern had fully taken hold, once the whole village had bent itself into ritual around it, the thing did not need to keep taking children forever. It could take anyone whose grief had already been hollowed out enough to make them easy to reach. Anna Mercer was the first adult. She was also the last. After that Thursday, Father Caldus ordered every church bell removed from its rope, and every flute, whistle, and reed instrument in the village burned. Thursday was no longer treated as a night to endure, but as a night to outlast in absolute silence. No songs, no lullabies, no humming, no calls between homes. No one answered any sound that seemed to come from beyond a wall, beneath a floor, or above a ceiling. By spring, Briar Hollow had lost 7 children and 1 mother. No one ever found them, but no one vanished on a Thursday again, which left the village with a final truth more unsettling than the disappearances themselves. They had not defeated what was taking them. They had only learned how to stop feeding it. What happened in Briar Hollow is remembered as a series of disappearances. That is true, but it is not the real shape of the story. The real shape is this. For 7 weeks, something taught an entire village to fear one night more than all the others. It taught them to count days, to dread a pattern, to distrust sleep, to watch their children breathe until their own minds started to slip. And once the village had fully reorganized itself around that fear, once every family had learned to live inside the expectation of Thursday night, the pattern changed. That is what makes Briar Hollow so difficult to forget. Not that one child went missing every Thursday, but that the disappearances may never have been the end of the pattern at all. They were only the method, because whatever moved through that village did not just take children. It taught the living exactly how to become vulnerable first. And by the time they understood that, they had already spent 7 weeks opening the same door.